Welcome to episode 3 of Lost in Transmission, a deeper dive into modern textual criticism. We're picking up where we left off, and now we're going to take a look at intentional changes with regards to the type of transmission errors. So we'd mentioned before that scholars say evidence suggests that the Hebrew text was flexible until about AD 100. That date is significant because that is when the rabbis closed on the Old Testament canon at the, I believe it was called the Council of Jamnia, around AD 100. That's when they chose to only include books written in Hebrew. So they did not include parts of the Septuagint that did not have a Hebrew lineage. So that's where the whole idea of Apocrypha started happening in the Deuterocanonical, where books like Maccabees do not have a Hebrew lineage. They're written in Greek. Also, we'll see some of the intentional changes, anachronisms and glosses and marginal notes and so on, and even theological changes. And in contrast to the New Testament, though, which appeared to be less flexible. And so some of the things, they correct spelling or grammar. They cleared up difficulties, and that's a little bit dodgy. Harmonization, that's also, that's where you try to get things to match, like in between the Gospels, for example. And so on. And we'll take a look at all of these types of changes. So, intentional changes. Evidence suggests that the Hebrew text was somewhat flexible until the 1st century AD when it became unified. Following the 1st century AD, the scribes' primary desire was to retain this text. The scribes clearly had a great reverence for the text. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that any changes were an attempt to improve or clarify the text with no intention of corrupting it. Let's stop right there. So that's an interesting statement. It almost seems like a contradiction. Let me read it again, this sentence. The scribes clearly had a great reverence for the text. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that any changes were an attempt to improve or clarify the text with no intention of corrupting it. That's interesting. The Jewish nation believed the scriptures were a living book with continuing relevance, prompting scribes occasionally to update or expand the text to make it more readily understandable. You know, that sentiment that's being expressed here would really resonate with the American culture where, you know, the Bible needs to get with the times, right? I mean, that seems to be what's being suggested here. Although I may be overreading what's being implied here, but what more could it mean? That it's a living book, continuing relevance, prompting scribes occasionally to update or expand the text. So that seems contradictory to me. I mean, if it's relevant in the current day, then why do you have to change it? What that suggests to me is just the opposite. That things that are becoming irrelevant need to be tweaked to make them relevant, getting with the time. So that's very interesting what the author here, Paul Wegner, what he's trying to, I would like to be able to talk to him, ask him to clarify what he means by that. Anyway, we'll continue. So we'll take a look at an Old Testament example. In Genesis 14:14, the Masoretic text says that Abraham chased the kings who captured his nephew Lot as far as Dan. But according to Joshua in 1947 and Judges 18:29, the city was not named Dan until many years after. It is plausible that a later scribe realized that the city was now called Dan and changed the text in Genesis to reflect this new name. So, that might explain the controversy about the dates of the Exodus as well, where the book of Exodus makes a reference to Ramses, but I don't want to rabbit trail into that. So this is an anachronism where the scribe realizes that this city is more well known to the hearer by this name. So really, it's an edit made to be understood by the reader is going to associate with that place with this newer name, and it's not the name that it was called back at that time. So that's interesting. And I wonder if that happened with Ramses in Exodus, like I said. And if you want to look into that, I'll assign you to research the controversy on the late or early date of Exodus, whether it was in like 1200 BC or 1400 something BC. Okay, New Testament example. It appears that Amen was added to some manuscripts. It gives a list here. In 1 Peter 5:14, possibly in order to make it more similar to the ending of 2 Peter. In their zealousness to preserve Scripture, scribes had a tendency to include everything in the text, glosses, marginal notes, insertion, rather than omit anything, thereby expanding the text in some places. The New Testament appears to have experienced less flexibility in the transmission process, but it's still plausible that copyists made modifications to certain texts. Since the transmission of Scripture occurred over such a long period of time and under such diverse conditions, it is possible that many intentional changes may never be detected, or if detected, the original wording may never be determined. Intentional changes are much more controversial. Not everyone agrees on the specific examples, but the following gives indication of the purpose of intentional changes. And see, will this thing expand? No. So, changes in spelling or grammar. Over time, scribes apparently tended to update archaic language so that the text could be better understood. That's very interesting. Because that's the argument that people make for updating like the King James Bible. They'll say, well, we can't use the King James Bible or the Douay Bible because it uses archaic language. And we don't really have the Douay anymore. We have the Challoner version. I mean, you can still read a copy of the original Douay Rheims Bible, but it's very difficult to read. It looks like those original King James Bibles with the old spelling types where S's look like F's and so on. But so that's very interesting that the scribe would do that with the original language. So we'll just go to a New Testament example. In Matthew, chapter 1, verse 7 and 8, the name Asaph is found in several older manuscripts, but later copyists apparently believed they were correcting the text, changing it to Asa, king of Judah. So there you go. They thought it was a mistake, so they changed it. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Clearing up difficulties. Since the biblical text was intended to be read and understood by people through many millennia, it is reasonable that copyists may have modified unclear phrases, rare words, or even words used in an unusual way so they could be more easily understood. New Testament example. The composite quotation from Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 43 in Mark chapter 1, 2, and 3 is sometimes attributed to Isaiah the prophet in earlier manuscripts, but some later copyists modified it to entois prophetes, in the prophets. So let's talk about that for a second. So what they're saying is that in the Gospels, there is a citation given. It's assuming an Isaiah authorship, the citation, but it comes from Malachi and Isaiah. And so probably in the earlier one, they would say Isaiah the prophet because Isaiah is a major prophet, where Malachi is a minor prophet. So you're going to say it's cited from Isaiah. That's reasonable. However, later scribes could see that might be considered a contradiction, so they want to clean it up and just say the prophets. So that's interesting. Harmonization. Harmonization is the modification of one passage to make it agree with another. This appears more commonly in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, where there are several similar accounts of a story. So, New Testament example. A variant of the phrase in John 19:20, ein gegramenon ebraisti romaisti Ellenisti. It was written in Hebrew, so here we go. Ebraisti, in Latin, Romaisti, like Roman, and in Latin, Ellenisti, Hellenist, Hellenistic, how you say Greek in Greek and Greek. And so they were added to Luke 28 to make it match. Make it match Luke. Or no, it was added to Luke to make it match John. So that's interesting, the whole idea of the Gospels. In fact, let's segue here for a second. So this is where we get the concept of what are the Gospels. Are they really history? They're not really. They're their own charisma. They're not history as we think of it today. For example, Matthew, we could think of Matthew as the Torah transfigured, where the evangelist is showing Christ as the king and showing the lineage. And for example, you see that in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew. It's in groups of 7, 7, 7, 7. But then when you compare those genealogies to like the Chronicles or in the Kings, you'll see that Matthew leaves people out. So he wants that 777. So he's taken liberties to make a theological point. Here's another way of thinking about it. The Gospels were written with echoes from the Old Testament. So what do I mean by that? So when Barack Obama gave his inauguration speech, he used this phrase, arc of history. What he's doing, he's drawing upon Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King made that phrase as well. So he's trying to make this association, this echo from the past. And so you find that. You find that in a lot of these citations in the gospel. I mean, it seems like they just pull citations from the gospel arbitrarily. When you read the so-called prophecy within the context of the Old Testament, you would never reach that conclusion unless you have the New Testament telling you that it's a prophecy. And so here you have these evangelists are drawing from the Old Testament to give you an echo from the past, sort of to create a narrative of who Jesus is. Jesus as Torah transfigured, or Jesus as the Israel, the redemption of Israel, personifying the redemption of Israel, or and so on. And so my point is that there's no reason to artificially harmonize, that each gospel stands on its own, and that we don't need to harmonize it as if it's history, that the evangelist is going to take liberties with the order of the narratives. For example, John has the clearing of the temple, I think, in the beginning of the gospel, right after the wedding feast of Cana, I believe, and then the synoptic gospels have it towards the end, and Jesus' final trip to Jerusalem. I mean, what is it? Were there 2 cleansings of the temple, or did John take liberty with the order of the stories to make a theological point? And I would argue it's the latter, that you'll find that in the Gospels, that the evangelists take lots of liberties to make their points, and they stress different things. Not to mention, the Gospels were written later than the epistles, and some scholars believe they're written rather later. Some would even say in the 2nd century. It's that the evangelists may be using the stories of Jesus in a way as a polemic against their current circumstance. Not necessarily against the circumstance at the time of Jesus. They're more broadly applying it, and so they're stressing different points that Jesus makes as an argument for their current circumstance. If they're being persecuted by the Roman emperor at the time, at the time of, and there might have been editions written by these communities that were associated with the evangelists. You know, you hear about the Johannine community or the Matthean community, and they may have made additions or added things to make arguments for their current time. I'm not saying that they totally made up things, but they may have drawn from oral tradition things that weren't inscripturated and added to it. And that's a controversial topic, but you'll see scholars make mention of such. For example, in the New American Bible, second edition, some of the comments. And also, you know, we're not even getting into the canonization or the synoptic problem, you know, in terms of the sources of the Gospels, for example. I mean, scholars pretty much agree across the board that there is an oral tradition of sayings of Jesus known as the Q or the Quell in German, and that the synoptic Gospels all draw from that, and that Mark is the first, and that Luke and Matthew draw from Mark. You're going to get Mark almost in its entirety in both Matthew and Luke. However, it's controversial whether Matthew was aware of Luke and vice versa. Some might believe that. And John seemed, in John's gospel, draws upon the Q and seems to draw upon some of the synoptic sources, but it's its own, it's totally a different type of gospel that pivots around the 7 signs and presents Jesus as the Son of God, and it stresses the deity of Christ, where Matthew stresses the kingship, Mark the suffering servant, Luke the Son of Man, and so on. So there's these different theological they're stressing different theological points in the Gospels for their communities and the different audiences. Matthew's written to a Jewish audience. Luke is written to a Gentile audience. Mark might have been written to a Roman audience. Mark is Peter's gospel, actually. When Mark was Peter's associate for some time before he was Paul's associate, or after. I'm not quite sure about the chronology there. So we need to understand that this is ancient literature and that it started with oral tradition, which captured orally the life of Jesus, for example, in the Gospels. When he walked on this earth, his earthly ministry, it was first captured in oral tradition, and then finally it was inscripturated with different agendas, to put it quite simply. Okay, euphemistic changes. A euphemism is the substitution of a milder term for a more unpleasant or offensive one, but sometimes changes were made simply to smooth out the grammar to help the text sound better. New Testament examples. Several scribes appeared to have had difficulty copying the phrase, "Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you," without adding the phrase, "in open" or "openly," or the word grammateon, scribes, without adding kai parapisiano, and the Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees. So let's see. Your Father reward you in heaven, without adding the phrase "in openly," or with the word scribes, and without adding Pharisees. So here you go. Scribes are trying to be politically correct, I guess. And so you get that in the translations from the original language to English, to the vulgar languages. And so apparently this has been ongoing through the ages with copyists wanting to smooth things out. Theological changes. Some changes apparently were made for theological reasons, either because God or someone else was placed in an unfavorable light or the text seemed irreverent. Modifications removed offending words or phrases. New Testament example. In Luke 2:41, the words "oi gones autou," his parents, have been changed to Joseph and Mary in some manuscripts, or Joseph and his mother, possibly to safeguard the doctrine of the virgin birth of Jesus. So there you go. So much for trying to preserve the autographs. Additional additions and glosses. There are several apparent instances of additions, glosses, explanatory notes, or further explanations of difficult words and phrases in the biblical text. These notes may have been originally written into the text or were later incorporated from marginal notes. In the New Testament especially, these additions are sometimes conflations, combining two or more readings. New Testament example. Some manuscripts of Luke 24:53 add the word amen at the end of the phrase, which suggests that some thought a gospel should end this way. Generally, it's easier to spot an unintentional change. They are more predictable, result of the copying process. An intentional error, on the other hand, is much more difficult to determine. Bruce Metzger observes, scribes who thought were more dangerous than those who wished merely to be faithful in copying what lay before them. Yeah, nice observation, Bruce. Intentional errors are much harder to detect and correct, since it is generally difficult to know why the changes were made. Sometimes scribes even reintroduced a previously corrected error, as Metzger points out. In the margin of Codex Vaticanus at Hebrews 1:3, this is an important verse too. He reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature, upholding the universe by the word of his power. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So in the margin of Codex Vaticanus at Hebrew 1:3, there's a curious, indignant note by a rather recent scribe, perhaps from the 13th century, who restored the original reading of the Codex Paneron, for which the corrector had substituted the usual reading Peiron. Fool and knave, can't you leave the old reading alone and not alter it? Then he writes the whole thing out. So there's corrections being made, and then they're correcting the correction, and then someone's correcting the secondary correction. So it's going back and forth. It's supposed to be black. No, it's supposed to be red. No, it's supposed to be black, and so on. So intentional errors were likely introduced into the text when the copies thought a word was misspelled, contained a theological mistake, or appeared not to correspond to another biblical passage. So here's a summary, as we mentioned. We don't need to go over this again. Of unintentional changes. I guess we can go real quickly. Mistaken letters, homophony, that's substitution or similar sounding words. Haplography, omissions of a letter. Ditography, a letter written like latter instead of later, whether it's two T's are written. Or we saw it can be more broadly applied to phrases, where part of a phrase can appear in one verse and then later in another verse accidentally repeated. Reversal of metathesis is reversal in order, like dog instead of God. Fusion is separating a compound word. Fission is incorrect division, making a fission is incorrect grandchild written as grandchild. So it's fission is dividing a compound word. Fusion is taking two words and combining them to make them a compound word wrongly. Homoi atelaton is an omission caused by two words of phrases that end similarly. And then a hoimoi orkton is an omission caused by two words or phrases that begin similarly. Then other omissions, and then intentional changes in spelling or grammar, clearing up difficulties, harmonization, euphemistic changes, which you don't want God to look bad, theological changes, and then taking part of a verse in a gloss and put it in the text, or vice versa. Okay, so we like to keep these videos under a half hour. We're at 25 minutes, and so in the next episode we'll start taking a look at the evidence, the actual manuscripts themselves and their attributes, starting with the New Testament prior to AD 100. So thanks for your attention, and see you in the next episode.